Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Wednesday, and we've got a threesome going on this morning. So I'll dispense with the normal chatter that I use to ease myself in the morning and say, "Welcome, Ron Coleman. How are you?"
Good morning. Hey, how you
So
doing? I'm all right, thank you.
you are listening to Law and Legitimacy, where each day Mike and I break down the world for you in terms that we don't understand, but we hope that you do. Ron, what's new and exciting in your world? We've got you listed here as a titan of free speech. Yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah,
Um,
I
you
don't
know.
know. I don't know. I'm not feeling so Titanic these days. I'm telling you, these judges.
It just means that you're in one piece, you know?
Oh,
So have you
fair
been
enough.
have you been reading through the report, the Durham Report? I've started reading through it yesterday, doing a pretty careful reading of it. And if you have, what's your view of it?
Oh no, wait. This is 2023. I don't need to read things to have a view about them, do I?
Well, I'm trying to, because I know Durham and he's thorough, and all the CHS material in the report really got to me, and because of my experience recently with the Proud Boys case and the prominence that confidential human sources played there. The thing that I like about the report is its discussion of the alleged protection or deference that the FBI gives to First Amendment issues and the care that it's supposed to take when investigating something that comes up to that limit. It appears that in the political context, where people are running for office, not from office, that the FBI's internal checks and balances failed. And I'm not sure that it's anything more than an ordinary failure. I don't know what your views are on that, so I throw it out for discussion.
Well, I mean, the ordinary failure that is the subject of national controversy can only remain ordinary for so long. There was a point at which people in management positions should have been doing quality control,
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
and it's saying, hey, what we seem to have an out of control situation here.
I
What am
think
I
the thing
missing?
that no, you're not. I the thing that strikes I heard a lot in the Proud Boys case about the FBI's need to respect the First Amendment and how they had safeguards to make sure that domestic groups weren't inadequately surveilled out of deference to the church committee and so forth. And I'll never know, because we entered a stipulation with with the Justice Department where they gave up the number of CHSs who were involved in surveilling the Proud Boys in exchange for our taking the foot off the gas and not demanding better answers from the FBI about the scope of CHS activity. I regretted that at the time because I thought, man, I'm never going to know as a citizen what I'd like to know, but I got what I need as a lawyer for my client, Mr. Biggs. And then CHSs keep popping up in the news all the time. So in the Durham report, what we find is, obviously Steele paid for and contracted for by a GPS fusion, which was funded by Hillary Clinton, ends up with a tip about Trump involved in with the Russians. And this in turn comes from a guy who'd previously been investigated for espionage, and whom the FBI should have had good reasons to be suspect about. Now, the FBI policy says before you open an investigation, you need to corroborate some of this material going in so that people aren't chilled in the exercise of their First Amendment rights. That whole enterprise was suspended, and according to the report, when similar, and it appears to be suspended because of an animus toward President Trump, or candidate Trump, or I guess then President Trump, when similar accusations about foreign influence were made as to Hillary, the checks and balances seem to apply, and formal investigations weren't opened. That to me is shocking, and I mean I don't
It,
know how to address that.
what you say when you say shocking, I assume you mean shocking that they admitted it, right? I mean, did you? Everyone knew. If you didn't know this before, Norm, I mean, welcome to the club. It's been open for 6 years. And this is not news. This is not news. Anybody with his eyes open had to realize this. The whole Comey performative garbage was proof of it. And the lack of accountability along the way was and remains really problematic. I want to address something that you said, which was that you had some regrets about your call, although you acknowledged that ultimately, as a lawyer and doing what you were, what your job was, which was to represent Joe, you did the right thing. I agree with that, and I would also point out tactically for those who don't know what you already know, you understood you were unlikely to get much more from the judge
That's
than
exactly
the
right.
FBI was going to give you voluntarily. I'm admitted to the DC bar, so I will be a little bit more cautious than I might otherwise in private be about the quality of judging that we've seen in the J6 cases there. But the FBI has been allowed to really get away with a phenomenal amount of I'm looking for the right adjective, but malfeasance is the word. It is obvious. Why on earth was an investigation allowed to even be opened up into a
Yeah.
candidate? I mean, because we think he has links with Russia. First of all, links with Russia. I mean, linked to. You know this from from dealing with Proud Boys cases. Linked to is one of the most ambiguous, meaningless, and legally insignificant terms used in journalism. Did Trump have people who were talking to people on the Russian side even during the campaign? I'm sure he did. Would it have been irresponsible for him not to? Yes, it would have been. Did Hillary Clinton, did her campaign have?
Yeah,
such
that was my
relationships?
take on this before. It always struck me as much ado about nothing. You don't expect a guy to walk in saying, "Oh, international." Yeah, I can. You don't want Sarah Palin in there. Oh, yeah, I see Russia on the map. I don't know anything about it. And so the double standards are troubling to me. But what's the answer? Because you've got an ordinary investigative failing by an agency without oversight. And I'm watching Jim Jordan and the Weaponization Committee, thinking they're just not pressing hard enough, and they're not asking the right questions. We've been in touch, people from the Proud Boys case with the J6 committee, saying, you should be asking questions about what happened in the sealed proceedings in our trial. We can't talk about it, but we had a public trial under the First Amendment, with a defendant's right to a speedy and public trial under the Sixth, where the press was routinely thrown out so that we could discuss issues that I'm ordered not to talk about individually, but can only refer to topically as confidential human sources. And now, it comes up again with respect to Hillary. It came up again, or with respect to Trump and Hillary. It comes up again with respect to Hunter Biden and the investigation of him. It comes up again with whistleblowers and talking about what's going on with the IRS. Where's Congress on this? I mean, isn't oversight the answer? And if
Yes.
so, how do we get effective oversight?
Yeah, and just to add to that, because I think that what I'm concerned with, I'm 33 years old. I'm a young attorney, early in my practice. We talk about these themes of legitimacy, and just for those viewers who have not had the pleasure of watching or listening to Norm and Ron together before, there's a unique chemistry that exists between these two gentlemen that transcends
Run.
that transcends the intellectual practice of law or the theory that underpins this stuff. There's something bigger, more, I think, spiritual, I'd like to say, that binds the two of you in a lot of these conversations. And what I'm looking at is this notion that perhaps this report is going to be all that comes of all the entire hoax culture that has been foisted upon us, to the point about Jim Jordan. He had a tweet, I think it was yesterday, just before noon, and he says Trump was right about, and he goes on this list: collusion, manufacturing, gas prices, inflation, the border, the wall, the press, the laptop, Afghanistan, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, Israel, foreign wars, trade, taxes, crime, and jobs. But what is Jim Jordan going to do? How do you affirmatively state something like that as the chair of the House Oversight Committee, right? How do you affirmatively state something like that so publicly, knowing that you are followed by so many people who are yearning for the Justice Department or someone to hold those accountable for the hoax culture that has been perpetuated on the whole of American society? And that's just objective, whether you're polarized to the right or to the left, right? Whether you were one of the 75 million that voted for the incumbent presidential candidate, or whether you were one of the almost 82 million that voted for the current president, Joe Biden, you have been laundered information in a way that we've never been laundered information as a society before. So my question ultimately is, how do we reconcile that Jim Jordan is the guy that we want to do more, but he just goes out here and tweets?
You ask many good questions. Let's go back to the beginning. First of all, Norm, your clients received neither an open trial nor a speedy trial. Let's be clear about that. The constitutional guarantee to a speedy trial has never been so routinely, uniformly, and systematically disregarded as it was with respect to the J6 cases. Number one. Number two, yeah, what you said. Is this look? This isn't a Jim Jordan problem. This isn't a Jim Jordan problem. He's one congressman with a certain amount of seniority in a legislature in one house of a legislature that has in which the Republicans maintain a razor thin majority. But I will agree with you that it would be absolutely foolish not to take advantage of the existence of that majority for the time that it may continue to exist and go to town with it. The problem is, we know several things. One of them is that a legislative oversight is no better than the trust and respect in which that legislative body is held by the other parts of the government. We now live in an era in which trust and good faith and what we might call collegiality or a sort of or comity among different branches and different offices of the government is over. During the Trump administration, we saw that the chief of staff was willing to literally to act in an insubordinate fashion, both publicly and privately, against the commander-in-chief. We saw that the judiciary became an arm essentially of one political party. And we saw that
well, and not to, but still largely is to this day, at least in the lower courts context, right?
Oh yeah. No, when I say became, I mean became and remained. Absolutely, yes, they have been transformed into, and I think that we, Norm and I, we should schedule an entire session solely to discuss the topic of judicial culture and how the internet, I think, has destroyed judicial culture, so that judges are now basically no different from journalists in the sense of looking at what their clerks tell them is going on in social media and following the consensus, not only with respect to high-level political issues, but even relatively routine litigation that implicates almost anything political. Mm-hmm. This is, I think, a gigantic issue, but one that's beyond the scope of today. But my real point is that the church committee didn't only achieve what it did, and it did achieve certain things. I mean, as you know, if as you say, the FBI felt it necessary to acknowledge the existence of limitations on its operation, even in 2023, even if only by, by what's it called? Word. What's the term for just saying things and
Stipulating?
no? But just they just say it. They don't really do it.
No.
Just lip
Okay.
service.
Lip service. Yeah, that's it. I'm very good with the metaphor. only by lip service. That achievement was not merely a result of the legislative power that the church committee had, but it was a result of a consensus of civic responsibility that existed across government and across the institutional press and other institutions in this country, which said that if there's something, if this is really an issue and it really matters to us and it matters in terms of maintaining our liberties, and we don't even have to wait for legislation to be passed for us to take this seriously. That doesn't happen anymore. And if there was any stake through the heart of that, of whatever trust in government continued to exist by the 2020s, the J6 committee was that stake, because it was the literal closest thing to the transformation of an American legislative body into a Stalinist-style show trial that has ever happened in American history.
Well, it sure felt that way from the well of the Proud Boys court. I mean, it seemed to me that the government was advancing, novel legal theories to get into evidence things that otherwise shouldn't be admitted. The court was permitting it, and we had the sense that the evidentiary rulings tilted in but one direction, and that was against the Proud Boys. But I want to return to something both you and Mike said, Ron, about this consensus or trust or sense of legitimacy. When I look at what the church committee report, I'm stunned by what it was able to accomplish. And I remember reading about it as a kid, thinking, "Now the FBI can't really be doing that." And then you read the documents, and yeah, they really were. And now, and they were doing it to the left, which to many people was tolerable at the time. I believe there are comparable abuses going on, and they're directed at the right now. And I worry that Jordan and company aren't willing to do the hard work, willing or able to do the hard work that it's going to take to unmask that. You look at the J6 committee and you read the report, say what you will about it, an enormous amount of work went into that. I don't see the same infrastructure being set to bear or focused at American law enforcement and its surveillance of the right or of domestic entities. And when I look at the report that Durham did and the press reaction to it, I see a lot of people poo-pooing it as mere propaganda. Mike, you refer to it as, unmasking of hoax culture and whatnot. I just think hoax and conspiracies have become the coin of the realm because we have implanted into us, a request or a need or a demand for meaning. And if we can't find it in consensus, we'll find it in fractions or in a fractured society. And we're going to each be potters saying to the potter, "Why makest me thus?" And in the absence of a consensus, we're going to drive ourselves apart. And so I may be looking for more out of this conversation than I can find. It's the rabbi in you, Ron, that makes me want to confess to the need for God. But it strikes to me that we've got, and I think Vivek Ramaswamy, kind of nails it. We've got a God-shaped hole in our heart or requesting for meaning. And when you fill that hole with the wrong thing, you get these kind of politics. And so, I'm not going to call him Saint Durham. But the report to me is another eye-opening example of the costs of a lack of consensus and the reception of this in the media. It's the report's politicization is remarkable because it's not a political document. It's a scholarly tome. I know Durham pretty well. He's from my home state. I've had him as a witness in cases of mine. I've had cases with him. This is classic Durham. It's classic FBI, the report at its best. Maybe cumbersome, maybe a slow-moving ship that can't be turned on a dime, but it's a thorough, painstaking review, and what it says is the institution failed. It failed to administer the law in an even-handed way, and so I guess the question from me is, can we get back to administration of law in an even-handed way? or is that impossible in the absence of trust? Because law is always a tool pointed at problems that appear to us, and if there's no consensus about what a good society looks, can that tool ever serve consensus? I don't know what your thoughts are on all that, but that's my takeaway from listening to the two of you and looking at this report.
The question is a very troubling one, because I have said in the past that there are three branches of a government in our system, right? And the executive is a political branch, and the legislative is a political branch, and I expect them to act politically. The judiciary is supposed to be the least political branch. We can't say it's not political, because the political branches nominate and confirm the judicial officers. Fine. But once that happens under the lifetime tenure system, the judiciary is supposed to be the least political. But the interesting thing about the FBI and the Justice Department is that they are one of a number of portals between two branches, between the between the executive and the judicial. And what I fear is that portal has become too easy to get through.
Yeah.
There's a revolving door in the justice system between the prosecutorial class and the prosecutor mentality and the judiciary. The number of federal judges who are former prosecutors should give us pause. When I was coming up in the profession, and certainly when you were coming up in the profession 30 years before that, there were always people who had spent time in the judiciary, in a U.S. attorney's office, but becoming a judge was the capstone of a successful legal career, sometimes in government, very often in private practice, almost always in litigation. And the idea was that someone had become a partner after a career at typically one law firm and had put aside a decent amount of income and was now going to take a bit of a pay cut to become a judge and engage in public service. And to use modern numbers just for comprehension purposes, you would have someone who was making, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 as a private practitioner, and would now settle in for $175,000 to $200,000 as a federal judge. But there were these benefits, and he had money in the bank, and it was something that someone in private practice could contemplate doing. Today, the top people in private practice, the people you would really want on the bench, are making multiple seven-figure draws year in and year out. And you might think, little bugs like me would think, well, then that's even better, because after 1 or 2 years of making that kind of money, you don't ever have to really work again. So being a judge, it's not like that at all. It's actually the contrary. People who are making multi-million dollars a year as partners in major firms, because they are the best. They're not necessarily the best trial lawyers or litigators, and we've both had experiences of kicking the asses of people in big firms because they're so robotic often and so lacking in imagination. But they certainly do know how to bring to bear massive resources and tried and true formulas to crush their opposition. These people are not considering the judiciary. They're not sending us their best, because people simply won't walk away from that kind of fortune. So we have a very large proportion of government servants in robes now. And you know what? Clarence Thomas was in government service for for his entire career. And he certainly wasn't infected with the mentality of government good with the rulers, that sort of problem that we have now. But I think it's a large part of our problem.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it certainly is in DC. I mean, that the number of federal prosecutors who are now federal judges is alarming. I mean, that was the case with Judge Kelly in the Proud Boys case, and he'd worked together with one of the senior prosecutors, uh, um, um, uh, supervising all of the J6 cases, at least the J6 insurrection cases. And it raised our eyebrows. It caused concerns among the clients, but as a matter of law, it wasn't enough to show a conflict. But I've often wondered whether there should be a per se rule. If getting a judgeship represents an increase in your pay, you should not be qualified to become a judge, because I think, it should be something of a sacrifice. And it may be that we need to do more for judicial salaries to attract some of the more independent and better minds to come into the judiciary. I personally favor a lifetime judiciary. I don't want elected judges. I don't want them worrying about the impact of their decisions in years to come.
And the
but I
problem
think
with the mandatory retirement age is you can play out a judge until, not if he's 50, but you can wait out a judge until he retires.
Question for you guys. How does this translate to the law enforcement side of things? Personally, I have a unique perspective on law enforcement because it's a subject matter area that I was raised around pretty intimately. And what I know now is that by and through working for business clients, I'm seeing sort of a rogue presence of local law enforcement as it's applied to businesses rather than individuals. So enforcement of criminal codes and stuff like that. And we can get into a longer discussion at a more opportune date about that. But my practice is shifting to accommodate how administrative agencies are now basically the proxies for enforcement of criminal statutes in municipalities all over the place. But I see that as sort of it's a symbiotic relationship. On one hand, you have law enforcement, which has been demonized wholesale in the last several years, and individual officers are not incentivized to take what they would calculate to be a risk of reputational damage or worse in trying to enforce on one-on-one basis what's going on out in the world today, right? So rises in violent crime, organized theft rings, these sorts of things. And then the administrative agencies obviously want to wield more and more power. They have this unilateral decision-making authority. They can treat property rights more as licenses from that perspective, and they can just kind of be judge, jury, and executioner, and subvert due process. So how much of what you're talking about with respect to the issues of qualified judgeships, basically, I hear the argument, Ron, that you're making as if they knew better, they would do better as it relates to the class of judges that are now sort of assuming the ranks. And maybe that's a bit reductive. I don't mean to assume too much there, but it does seem as though the pool of qualified applicants in law enforcement, which would, extend more to the executive branch, is feeling somewhat similar, right? We're losing those tenured officers that hold certain value sets, who came up during a time that is uniquely different from the social climate that we live in. And anyway, I'll just stop rambling. But my question is, how much of that is also sort of seen in the executive side?
You make a fantastic point, and I've seen this with my own clients. There is a real problem, and again, it does to a large extent come down to judges. And I'm thinking now of judges in state courts who, they, to put it in a really, they have been for a generation raised to defer to government, and the law in all the jurisdictions where I practice is that a government act is presumptively correct.
Yeah.
And again, that made a lot of sense in an era of good faith and trust and consensus. But in an era where government has routinely and regularly and scandalously betrayed that trust, I think that test is worth taking another look at. Now, let me be clear that by unhinging legitimacy from government in the courtroom, what you risk is letting judges make policy even more than they do now. In other words, a judge no longer has to say, well, listen, there's an agency that's given this power, but I've got a better idea, which judges do all the time, but they can't do it through the front door like that. I guess it's a pendulum. And right now the pendulum has swung in the direction of, we don't have to worry about judges second guessing government, whether it's agencies or legislatures. We have to worry about them laying down in front of government. And by the way, the tone for this was set during COVID, when the Supreme Court just repeatedly shrugged its shoulders and said, well, police power, police power. Police power. Hey,
police power, qualified immunity, Chevron deference. I mean, there's always a reason for the judiciary to abdicate its responsibility to step up for the Bill of Rights. But is the solution elimination of Chevron? The court's
Chevron would be a good start.
Yeah.
Chevron would be a very good place to start, and it would send an important message. This deference is just. I mean, also, we've also reached a point where legislatures, we have a kind of radicalism among elected officials that I think hasn't really existed on this scale in 100 years.
Well, and that's bracing, because I don't think that most of us are going to want to live with the consequences of some of the legislation that's being proposed. And if the court's going to defer to the legislature, and because they are our representative bodies, but they don't represent the consensus, then there's going to be greater polarization and more trouble to come. I mean, this is not the conversation I expected to be having this morning, because it's pushing me into a grim corner. And I don't want to say a sense of desperation, but a real longing for something like consensus again. And I don't know how to make it. I don't know how to create it.
I can tell you that it is a grim situation, because I in the same vein that I'm talking about the administrative agencies exercising, authority that arguably they don't have, or just is a clear departure from sort of a service model that has largely been the defining characteristic of legitimizing those sorts of agencies. At the same time, we're seeing a decline in the competence and ability of legislators, period. So when it comes to revising law, not recognizing consequences and downstream effects, and I don't necessarily think that that's unique to this moment in time, but it certainly is a force multiplier in and among what we're talking about more broadly now, where you have a practical decline in enforcement of law, a loss of top line legitimacy or perceived legitimacy from the governed population, and then elected legislators that are unintentionally or worse, creating an even more dire situation in the field.
Mm-hmm. It's cracking up. It is. The system is cracking up. There is a legitimacy crisis. I have to. I know we only have another minute or so.
Yeah.
I have to mention, as part of this calculus, the fact that to live in an era in which it is now accepted, politically and culturally accepted, that prosecutors announce upon assuming office what laws will no longer be enforced in their jurisdictions. That's a huge problem.
It is. Look, we bit off a lot more than we can easily chew in a half an hour or even longer. So, and we are out of time, folks. We committed to a brief interview, and thank you, Ron, for honoring that. We'll get back at this later. Ron, one book. Give us one book that we should read that would help us find our way out of this, if we were inclined to think.
If we were inclined to think, one book. Oh gosh, I wasn't ready for that.
Me neither, but all right. Well, we'll get back to it another time. Ron Coleman, thanks for joining us, folks.
Everyone should read The First Circle. You think it's about a different country, a different time. It's about tyranny. It's about what people become under tyranny. Solzhenitsyn's The First Circle.
Well, I think that's a good point. I read Michael Malice's White Pill. I think I'm reading that right now. It's same sort of thing. You think totalitarianism can't happen here. It's happening, folks, and we're being compressed into a one-dimensional universe in which we don't recognize options, and we don't recognize options because we don't aspire to standards that transcend immediate circumstances. The quest for the eternal goes on, and I think if you eliminate the quest for meaning and settle for mere satisfaction, you'll be profoundly dissatisfied. Socrates once said, "Better to be a fool dissatisfied than not." And I would rather be that fool. And I know Ron would as well, and Mike would as well. So we'll be back at you tomorrow with more. Ron, thanks for joining us.
A pleasure.
Mike, I thought you were going to be streaming us. I didn't know you were going to be on here today, so I didn't dress up with like fancy questions. Thank you so much for coming in.
Well, look, we got tomorrow. Norm reasserts his dominance on the comedic stage, 10 p.m. at Mohegan Sun.
Ned the Coffin. We will be debuting Ned the Cough Salesman, and it will live improv. So, I might spot people in the office and try to guess what kind of coffin I can sell you for your date with the Eternal. So come on out to Mohegan Sun. Join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. We'll have a good time. Thanks,
of course. Folks. And again, Ron, thank you. I'll put this back up on the screen at Ron Coleman on Twitter. Coleman Nation is his podcast. Do go back and look for the previous episodes of Norm and Ron discussing on both Coleman Nation and Law and Legitimacy. For those audio only listeners, thank you for listening. Please share, rate us 5 stars. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, etc. And we're here every Monday through Friday morning at 8 Eastern, broadcasting on Rumble, YouTube, and Twitter. And I just noticed that Patis Podcast, the Law and Legitimacy Twitter account, got its little blue check. So I'm feeling a little nice today. So
we're a blue check deli. All right.
We are. Yeah. Maybe we'll start penetrating the algorithms a little better. Anyway, Ron, again, thank you for your time. Norm, I will see you tomorrow morning, and everybody else will see you tomorrow morning at 8 a.m.
See you guys.
Drive safely, Ron. Thanks.
Sure.